Hi folks, Mark here again, and this is episode 15 of Re-examining the End Times, which is based on my book, The Threshold of Exile, and we are now dealing with the Olivet Discourse, and specifically Matthew 24:15, and the parallels in Mark and Luke, and raising some questions about this, what Jesus referred to as the abomination of desolation. And we're raising some questions about some of our future-oriented eschatology of thinking that this fellow called Antichrist, the man of sin, and all of this, I think, sits at the heart of the whole futurist eschatology about this evil satanic individual who is going to sit in the temple, a rebuilt temple in Jerusalem one day in the heart of the Great Tribulation, which is going to bring about the end of the world. And of course, we began to discuss some things last time about how this whole discussion of Jesus about the abomination of desolation really brings us to a focus in 1 Thessalonians far more than it has anything to do with the Antichrist, which is mentioned in John, or the dragon that's mentioned in Revelation. A lot of these things are imposed on that text that I don't believe are really relevant. They have completely different focal points. And so, but in 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, we began to unpackage a little bit some of what Paul was talking about this whole situation. And we began to talk first from just what's there from an eschatological standpoint, a near-term eschatology, and what is Paul really saying to the Thessalonians, and what is his real themes. And we saw in 1 Thessalonians 1, 9 and 10 that he told the Thessalonians that they were waiting for the Son of God from heaven. And that would be sort of a crazy thing if Paul was actually wrong, because then we'd have to certainly question about what he might have been wrong about other things. And we covered that subject matter a little bit earlier on in some earlier episodes. Then in 1 Thessalonians 2 and 14, he makes a remark about the church being persecuted and suffering persecution, which will come into play in 2 Thessalonians into some very interesting remarks that he makes in 2 Thessalonians 1, which we'll talk about in a minute. But and then he talks about this whole idea of the Lord coming as a thief, and that this first century Thessalonican church, was not in darkness, that day would overtake them like a thief, which is kind of interesting again, that he's talking about the day of the Lord, the coming of the Lord in their lifetime would not come like a thief. Then as we turn to 2 Thessalonians, we learn in 2 Thessalonians 1 that God would execute vengeance on their behalf to bring relief to them. And so the question was, well, when will that relief occur? And he tells us in verses 8 through 10 that when Jesus is revealed from heaven in flaming fire, and which is very interesting because if Paul and these Thessalonians were going to get relief when Jesus came, it would be kind of odd for him to be saying that for an occurrence that was going to be happening 2,000 or more years beyond their lifetime. They were anticipating some kind of judgment or vengeance coming of Jesus, which was, of course, to be the destruction of the temple and the destruction of the Old Covenant age. And even Luke mentions that in Luke 21, 20 to 24, when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies, that these are going to be the days of vengeance. Okay, he calls them the days of vengeance. And then as he goes to chapter 2 of 2 Thessalonians, we discuss this idea that the Thessalonians had, that he had to address fears that the day of the Lord had already come. And this was based on letters from people who supposedly were representing themselves as Paul, or one or other individuals as Paul companions, were representing him that this day of the Lord had already came. And we raised the question, well, if these people believed that there was going to be a rapture and that they were going to disappear from the planet, how is it that Paul would have still been there to write a letter saying that the day of the Lord had already come? And then he proceeded to talk to them in 2 Thessalonians 2 that the apostasia, or the apostasy, must first happen, and the son of man of sin must surface, must be revealed or come to the surface. And what Paul is talking about here is not what is commonly understood to be some kind of religious or great falling away of an end-time church, or in some circles it is believed this Laodicean era where this last church that's mentioned in Revelation chapter 3, this Laodicea, is somehow to represent the last days church. There's a lot of folly in that, and we'll talk about it when we get into the book of Revelation in our study. But for now, this word apostasy, or apostasia in the Greek text, also means a revolt. In a political sense, it is a revolt. And I would suggest to you that what Paul is referring to here is that the day of the Lord, this coming day of the Lord upon judgment upon Jerusalem, was to be preceded by a revolt. And that revolt was the Jewish revolt, which the outbreak of which began in 66 AD, and the Jewish war continued till the destruction of Jerusalem in AD 70. And although the war actually technically continued until Masada in 73, the final blow was really the destruction of the city and the temple in 70 AD. But there's this man of sin, son of perdition, who must be revealed. And some have suggested this was some kind of a Roman leader, but actually the phrase man of sin, the son of perdition, is the same phrase that's used only one other time in the New Testament, and that is referring to Judas Iscariot. And so I would take from that this individual is a Jew, is a Jewish leader of some kind for in the revolt. And we'll get a little bit more into that today in this session. And we learn about him also that he is lawless, that he opposes authority, and that he commandeers the temple of God. And we emphatically pointed out that this temple is not a rebuilt future temple. It is the temple in which was standing at the time Paul wrote Thessalonians. And we've also pointed out that there is not a single text in the New Testament that indicates that a future temple, third temple, would be rebuilt before the end of the world. Paul is talking about the structure that was existing at the very time that he wrote the letter, and that to assume that we must interpret this around the assumption of a rebuilt temple is an entirely wrong-headed way to interpret the text, and that assumption is what we call in literature a suppressed premise. It means that it's an underlying idea that must be imposed on the text because it's not actually explicitly said. It's just simply imposed on the text if this is going to occur in the future, that means there must be a temple. Well, it's not occurring in the future. Paul's talking about a revolt that was going to start in about 14 years from the time that he wrote the letter. And then he also says that this leader is sitting, positions themselves in the temple, and this person does not have to be sitting, so to speak. We learned in both in Ephesians, where Paul writes that we have been seated with Christ in the heavenly places. Does not mean that you or I are sitting up there. It means that we've been positioned. Okay, and so even though the Greek term can literally mean to seat, Jesus also mentioned that the the Pharisees in Matthew 23, he says they have seated themselves in the chair of Moses. Well, no, they weren't literally sitting in Moses' chair as if he had one there. It was the fact that they've positioned themselves in a position of authority under the authority of Moses or the Mosaic law as interpreters and keepers and instructors and enforcers of the Mosaic law. So this all has to do now with something going on in the temple that relates to the revolt. And what I'm going to do is call your attention right now to the maps, which praise God, they were furnished on a website called josephus.org, where G.J. Goldberg has provided some maps of diagrams based on the war history, which, by the way, I want you to know, was very, very foggy. Can be difficult sometimes for the layman to sort out the different Jewish leaders, the different high priests, the different factions that were all in this chaos, or in what we commonly call the fog of war. And so we can see the elements of what Paul's trying to say in Thessalonians, but not necessarily in an exact way to say this person is this or that person is that, but there's certainly sufficient evidence for us to see that this has very much to do with what Paul's trying to say about the man of sin taking a seat in the temple. Now, if you look, pay attention especially to the blue colored areas. I want you to notice here in the first diagram, in January of 68 AD, we have one zealot leader, Eleazar, and you'll notice where he's camped out. He has commandeered the Holy of Holies in the temple. He has made a stronghold here, okay? Now, this is pretty heavy-duty stuff when you think about this place that is the throne room of God that should be taken over by a nationalistic group who claim to be representing God, are actually moving in and commandeering his holy place, the temple. And Jesus did say that this abomination of desolation would take place in a holy place. Then as we go to this next diagram, we see a larger array of zealots. That is about a month or so later in Jerusalem. We see zealots, and we also see that the Idumeans were admitted into the city, and this again was very much like what happened to during the time of Antiochus Epiphanes in the 2nd century, the fierce Syrian king who was notorious for having commandeered the temple and putting an altar to Zeus and sacrificing a pig. But again, it was the apostate Jewish high priest Menelaus who admitted him in, who guided him in to allow this to happen. And so the responsible parties for this still falls on the Jews themselves. And we're going to read a little bit from Josephus, the 1st century historian, on just that very thing. Then you can go to the third image, and again we have another a little farther into the war period in April of 69. Now we have this fellow John of Gischala, who was another zealot leader. I happen to be among those who believe that he was actually the one who is the man of sin. There's a lot of history behind him, and he took a very, very powerful, almost kingly role at this later period of the war. But again, you can see the blue area where we see this this whole temple area being commandeered by the zealots, by John, as a military stronghold during the war. And then finally in Jerusalem again in December of 69, and this is basically about 6 months before the fall of the city and the temple, we have a three-way battle going on. And this is rather interesting, and we'll discuss this when we study Revelation, that John notes in his vision that the city was split, that into three parts. And this is actually what is going on here. What I think John is seeing was the the factions of the zealots that were all in Jerusalem at the time of the Jewish war. And again, we see Eleazar moves into the Holy of Holies. John is still in the temple area. So the whole point of this is to let you just see what was going on during this several years of the war era and the siege in which when Rome had moved in to surround Jerusalem, and the zealots factions were vying for power and control. But the most disrupting thing, or the most significant thing here, is that they were using the Holy of Holies. You see, they were occupying the most holy place upon the earth, God's own throne room in the temple, and this was all during the war. You know, this mystery of lawlessness that Paul's going to talk about in these verses here, in this whole section of 2 Thessalonians. The idea of a mystery is something that has been brewing, or something that has been there but hasn't been revealed. And we see this mystery of these lawless zealots has been a movement that's been pretty much underground for almost 100 years, and then comes to light during the later years prior to the war. But one writer insightfully noted that this idea of mystery in the Bible often refers to two becoming one. So when he talks, for example, Paul talks in Ephesians 5 about Christ and the church, or a man and a woman becoming one flesh. He says this mystery is great, okay? Or there's the mystery of Christ in you, the hope of glory. And what we have here, this mystery of lawlessness, is really Jewish nationalism and the religion of Moses being blended together during this revolt, okay? And Jewish nationalism at the time took its place in usurped or commandeered the holiness of God, the law of God concerning the temple, concerning the holy place and its sanctity, okay? And so now also in these verses we learn that some texts say that this Antichrist proclaimed to be God, or this figure, this man of sin, proclaimed to be God. I just want to take note of the fact that the word there that's translated proclaimed, if your Bible says that, or declare, apodiknomi in Greek, is not necessarily a verbal declaration. As a matter of fact, nowhere in the Bible does it shown as a verbal declaration. It shows up in the Greek translation of the Old Testament, in the Septuagint, what we call, in Esther 2:9, and it's translated that the maidens are exhibited or shown or provided for Esther in Esther 2:9. And it's actually the word that is a translation of the Hebrew word ra'ah, which means to see, okay? It means to show or to see, okay? And then it's used again in Job 33:21, where he speaks of Job's bones being exhibited or exposed because of his festering wounds. And we all know that terrible story of the man Job and what he went through, the pain and the sorrow and the trial that he went through. But whether exactly this is what happened, or it's just a metaphorical or an exaggeration of his condition, but it speaks of his bones being exposed. Then in the New Testament, the same word appears 4 times. He says that God attested, okay, or showed Jesus through his power and miracles. In Acts 25:7, it says that Paul's was standing trial, or being called into question. It says that they could not prove or demonstrate charges against Paul. And then again in 1 Corinthians 4:9, he says, God has exhibited us apostles last. And so this text in 2 Thessalonians 4 is the only place in the Bible, in the Greek text of the Bible, that suggests that this figure, this man of sin, proclaimed or said, I am God. Well, no, he did not. He sat in the seat or occupied or commandeered that particular holy place, setting himself up as if he was God. And this could be any one of the zealot leaders. There was John, Eleazar, Simon, Menachem. These are all different leaders who could have fit that bill, although I'm kind of doubtful of Menachem because I believe he was more among the moderates. I don't believe he actually ever occupied the temple area. But these zealots set up a military stronghold in the Holy of Holies, but there is no record anywhere of the zealot leader declaring to be God. Now here's my take, okay, on this whole idea of showing himself to be God, okay? And this is in stark contrast to this whole idea that there's going to be this devil person, a satanic person sitting in a temple saying, I am God, worship me, okay? It doesn't read that way, all right? And I'm not a Greek scholar, but just a matter of going in and looking up these words and how they're used and how it's used, its usage in the Bible, in the Greek Old Testament and the Greek New Testament. This is the way I'm going to share it with you in my thought of how this works. I think it'd be like a child sitting at a teacher's desk, and a teacher's late for class. And this child is sitting at the teacher's desk, all, huffy about, being a little arrogant. That child does not have to say, I am the teacher. They're exhibiting themselves falsely as such just by occupying that space. And also in Jerusalem, the people's impression of these zealot leaders may have been such that the fire had not come down out of heaven to destroy them as they occupied. Maybe they were something special. Maybe they were. Maybe he was a messianic figure that would lead them in a defeat of Rome. And these especially John of Gischala, they hired false prophets to do false miracles and false tricks and all sorts of things to try to get the people to believe them that they were some special person sent from God to lead the victory against Rome. And so, it was Adab and Abihu were Aaron's sons. In the book of Leviticus, we learn that they went into the Holy of Holies, or they actually at least into the holy place, to light the fire of incense. And they were unauthorized to do that, and God simply consumed them, okay, and said that, hey, you're going to treat me holy if you go in there. And there was a commandment that no one was supposed to drink wine when they went into that place. And here these Jews zealots were drinking the holy wine and using the oil, or pouring out the oil and just abusing everything that was holy at that time. And so, no, they didn't have to say, I am God. They just simply commandeered that area. They showed themselves forth in the same way that the child sitting at a teacher's desk would be, with chest, protruding, like, look at me, I'm sitting in the temple. So let's just get this into perspective of what Paul was actually talking about. Now, next he goes into verse 5 to 7 in 2 Thessalonians 2 and says that, don't you remember when I was with you that I told you these things? And this, of course, it was Paul's reminder. We don't know exactly what that discussion was, but these things, okay, Paul is basically saying these are the things that we talked about, that I told you about. And he says, you, the Thessalonians, know what is restraining him, so that now he may be revealed in its time. For the mystery of lawlessness is already at work. Only he who now restrains it will do so until he is out of the way, and then the lawless one will be revealed. We stop there in the middle of verse 8 for a moment. Paul is, of course, giving them first a reminder of the things that he had told them about that would happen prior to the day of the Lord, okay, so that it had not already had come. Then he begins to talk about this restraining force. Very interesting. First he says what? You know what is restraining him. And then he talks about he being taken out of the way. So we have a what and we have a he. And it's very interesting. So if you really were to look into the history of this, that the restraining force during this time before this all could be revealed was probably the Sanhedrin or the high priesthood. These were predominantly Sadducees, okay? And the Sadducees, the highest Jewish court, acted as a mediating force between the Jewish population and the Roman authorities. And they, during this whole time, were attempting to maintain order and prevent further conflict with radical groups who were advocating rebellion against Rome. Now, they were selfish in their motivation, okay? They had a vested interest in Israel keeping good relationships with Rome. This was a money-making deal with them and Rome, and they had a vested interest in maintaining their financial security. So there's no nobility here, but this whole force of the Jewish Sanhedrin and the priesthood were constantly in kind of a middle, restraining the activity of the zealots. But as their influence began to wane as the war escalated, many members of the Sanhedrin, probably among the Pharisees, ultimately sided with the zealots. Now, the Sanhedrin, the Sadducees probably never did, but the Pharisees were a little more radical in some of their thinking and more anti-Rome in their thinking. And so it's probably the Pharisees who we're talking about here that began to side with the zealots, and that continued to the growing unrest and ultimately to the destruction of the city and the temple. John Noy, an author who has written extensively in this more preteristic aspect of these, what we're believing, the belief that this stuff is all past, he says that the best answer, we believe, is that it was both an office, the what, and a person, the one or the he. More specifically, it was the institution of the Jewish priesthood led by Ananus, the high priest. The priesthood opposed the Jewish zealot-led rebellion, and Ananus wanted peace with Rome. As long as he and the priesthood stood in the way, the lawlessness of the Jewish zealots was held back. The work of Satan could not reach its full realization, and the man of sin could appear on the scene and could not cause a final destruction. Now we're going to continue. There's more to this, but this is just the first half, okay? Now we go to the restraining force as an individual, as the he. Ananus the high priest had tremendous diplomatic skills and was able to negotiate peace treaties with Rome many times before this. Ananus was literally able to restrain full-scale rebellion that John of Gischala was aiming to accomplish. However, Noe continues. In AD 68, Jewish zealots, with the assistance of the Idumeans, murdered Ananus and over 12,000 priests and left their bodies unburied, which, by the way, was a violation of Jewish law. Thus, the priesthood was taken out of the way. The restraining force was now taken out of the way. Now, listen to the first century historian Josephus, who provides much detail about the Jewish-Roman War. He says, "I should not mistake if I said that the death of Ananus was the beginning of the destruction of the city, and that from this very day may be dated the overthrow of her wall and the ruin of her affairs." So now, moving on from that, the rebel factions, Paul says, the mystery of lawlessness, which we said was already at work, that these rebel factions were already active at the time that Paul wrote his letter. They were an underground anti-imperialist movement dedicated to driving the Romans out of the Holy Land. Now, the Holy Land had occupied it since 63 BC. Herod's dynasty had ruled them for many years. This revolt had continuously seethed mostly underground for more than 100 years, from the time of Herod which he became king in 37 BC, and that would be until the Romans destroyed the city in 70 AD. Now, let's see how he tells us in 2 Thessalonians 2:8b and beyond that the Lord Jesus would kill or slay or destroy with the breath of his mouth to bring to nothing by the appearance of his coming. Now this is kind of interesting because there's a redundancy here. He says he will kill or he will consume or slay with the breath of his mouth and bring to nothing at the appearance of his coming. Now previously I had explained to you about this word kai in Greek. It means even, that is to say, this is the same as that, or the second half, the second phrase explains the first. So this consuming or eliminating or destroying of this zealot leader means the same as to bring him to nothing. And so what we find out is, well, Simon, one of the zealot leaders, was killed. John was captured and imprisoned in Rome. Okay, and so it isn't necessary for this leader to be killed in the conflict, okay, but he could be brought to nothing. I understand that John hid in caverns until hunger actually brought him out. He was captured and dragged off to Jerusalem. Now, finally, we're going to point out that then Paul revisits this idea of the man of sin and those who believe the lie in 2 Thessalonians 2:9-12. He says, the coming of the lawless one is by the activity of Satan with all power, false signs and wonders, and with all wicked deception for those who are perishing because they refuse to love the truth and so be saved. Therefore God sends them a strong delusion so that they may believe what is false, in order that they may be condemned, who did not believe the truth but had pleasure in unrighteousness. And so we learned previously, and we will continue, and we will get into that further, that these zealot leaders hired false prophets to do false miracles, and this whole thing was satanically led, and that this delusion of being told that God's going to give you victory, the Romans won't take the city, this whole delusion kept the fires burning of the rebellion, and it was a big lie, it was a big decision, and Josephus tells us eventually that when it was over 1 million Jews had perished in the city, and another 100,000 or so were taken captive. Now, let me just close this, and we're going a little longer than usual today, but there's a lot to cover, and I know this is very extensive amount of historical information, and some of it's probably kind of foggy. But who is conspicuously, stunningly, and remarkably absent from these texts? Paul says nothing about an antichrist. Nothing. Nothing about anyone called Antichrist. And so we are going to go next into John's epistles, and we're going to see exactly what the New Testament has to say about this individual called Antichrist. Amen. Well, we're going to have to close it there. I hope you're able to navigate through this with me. May God bless you, and stick with me as we will go to episode 16, and our subject will be the Antichrist. God bless you. Thanks again for joining.